Food Forward South Africa is calling for a policy to govern food donations in order to address food insecurity while saving the environment. The organization says there are more than 10 million tons of good quality edible food that is either lost or wasted throughout the supply chain annually. Food Forward South Africa Managing Director Andy du Plessis joins us now to unpack this conversation just a bit. Andy, thanks for your time. It's a concerning number, 10 million tons of food wasted, while South Africa faces more than 30 million households that are facing food insecurity every day. Where does the responsibility of the waste lie?
Good afternoon, Veronica, and thank you very much for having us. Absolutely, it's unconscionable, it's indefensible, it's unjustifiable that in a country where millions of people are food insecure and over 1.7 million children are malnourished in South Africa, that we have over 10 million tons of food that's lost or wasted. To put it in perspective, South Africa produces just over 32 million tons of food on an annual basis. So we are not a food insecure country. We have more than enough food to feed everyone. And yet of that 10 million tons, or 1/3 of that food we produce every year never reaches people's tables. And that's because of a whole range of supply chain inadequacies and weaknesses, supply chain disruptions across the value chain, things like specification requirements that are so high, and those kind of issues are what causes so much food to be lost or wasted across our food system. And we're talking right across our food system from farm to fork. That 10 million tons of food you mentioned in your introduction, about 27% of that is on the agri side, on farmer side and post-harvest handling. About 49% of that food loss and waste happens in the manufacturing sector. So we have a huge problem in South Africa.
And all of this just going into the bin. It would be quite a simple question to ask, to simply say, just how does this happen? And then I think when you talk about something like a food donation policy, how would this address this excessive amount of waste?
So Veronica, we've done some calculations. If we were to salvage or save just 5 million of that 10 million tons, 50% of that 10 million tons, we could provide 2 meals a day to around 30 million people. We could eradicate hunger in our time. We could eradicate the problems of malnutrition, where children are going to school hungry, not able to learn, where they have to go hungry to bed, to sleep at night without having food in their tummies, where parents have to skip meals, where they have to eat smaller meals just to stretch the amount of food, because over 90 million people in South Africa survive on social grants only. So a food donations policy, in other words, where we are able to say to farmers, manufacturers, retailers, it's illegal to dump good, edible, surplus food, usable food. Rather, let's divert it away timeously because it's edible, it's within date, it's good for human consumption, and most of that food is nutritious food. Let's have a policy that can regulate these donations. France has a policy like that. Italy has similar policies where they regulate and makes it illegal to dump food in a country where we overproduce so much food and yet millions of people are food insecure. And we just need government to come to the party and regulate this environment on our behalf.
And Andy, as I hear you speak, I think I have to be one person that's also quite guilty of this, specifically when you talk about edible food that is within date. How often do we look into our pantry and we see that best before date and we toss it away? I've seen even local supermarkets when they take some of the food off the shelf into the trolleys, and one has to wonder, where does that food go? Is that part of the problem or is that part of the solution?
Actually, that's a huge part of the problem. So date labeling issues are a huge concern in South Africa. What people don't realize is that when you come to close to a best before date, that food is still edible even after its best before date, because it's simply a best guess as to the quality and food safety of that food. But after the best before date, that food is still edible, it's still good for human consumption. around 18% of food waste happens on the consumer side, in households, in people's pantries. And it's important there that people understand that when we throw away food into a bin, it has to go somewhere, and it's going into landfills. Now, we've got a huge climate crisis across the world. Globally, food loss and waste accounts for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, causing huge amounts of climate impact. So we in South Africa have been experiencing frequency of floods, and the floods are getting worse. We're getting torrential rates on a regular basis across South Africa. So climate impacts are affecting our food security, it's damaging households, and it's destroying infrastructure. We can solve two problems at the same time by using simple solutions. Firstly, reduce the amount of food loss and waste that's ending up in landfills, timeously recovering that food, which is what FoodForward South Africa does. And we address the problem of food insecurity and malnutrition at the same time. We kill two birds with one stone, Veronica.
Yeah, and I think a big part of this, as you've mentioned, that ripple effect, definitely at the heart of it is also the lack of, information or education among consumers as well. For example, you speak about the best before date, and then there's also the expiry date. That communication, that education to consumers, it's also quite crucial in regards to how we manage food. But talk to us a little bit about the difference and the responsibility as well that consumers have towards ensuring that food is not wasted.
Yeah, I think when food is not wasted, everybody wins. Because just think about this, Veronica. If more food is wasted and manufacturers need to recoup that cost of that food that they're wasting, 1/3 of that food in some cases, somebody's going to pay for that loss. In other words, the consumer is paying for that loss. And this is the problem that we can solve, where we make sure that food that is good for edible consumption, that is within date, that is edible, that kind of food must be salvaged in time to reduce food insecurity and malnutrition. The best before dates and the expiry dates are important. In fact, the health department are in the process of revising those dates to make things a bit more clearer for consumers. But once food has reached this expiry date, it is not good for human consumption, and it is not safe to eat. But most of our foods on the shop shelves in the supermarkets these days have a best before date, a recommended date, which is where they can guarantee the best quality and the best safety of that food. But after that best before date, food is still good for human consumption. The problem is so much food that is still within date, and by best before date, we mean within date. That good is still good for human consumption, and people are throwing away that food because they are equating that to an expiry date, and they are definitely not the same.
Yeah, and it's, of course, a coincidence that we're having this conversation on the International Day of Awareness of Food Loss and Waste. Very quickly, going back to the suggestion of a food donation policy. Talk to us about the recommendations. I heard you mentioning the fact that it should be illegal, as you said, from farmers, manufacturers, supermarkets to waste food. But what else could this framework suggest in terms of, stemming or stopping this issue?
Yeah, so there are a few things that we can do. I think firstly, it's important to make sure that at our landfill sites, we regulate what food is going into our landfills. We are fast running out of landfill space, and we cannot allow organic waste, things like fruits and vegetables that are still good for human consumption, that just because it hasn't been sold, it doesn't mean that food is not good for human consumption. So a lot of foods in the agri sector, for example, that are fruits and vegetables that have small specification issues, blemishes, black marks, whatever the case may be, that food is still good for human consumption. But that food is rejected by either a manufacturer or a retailer because the consumer is going to think that there's something wrong with that. So a food donations policy will guarantee that food that is still edible, good for human consumption, and within date, that kind of food should not be dumped in landfill. It should be criminalized, because in a country where 20 million, 30 million people are food insecure and a huge amount of our children are malnourished, it is unconscionable to have that food thrown away. Secondly, Government needs to enable the work of non-profit organizations that are doing food rescue and food recovery. Huge amounts of resources we spend into procuring vehicles, warehouses, cold chain capability, so that we can recover that food timelessly, and then we make sure we get that to people in need. On an annual basis, we redistribute around 22 million tons of food, and we make sure that that food reaches people. Over 88 million meals can be salvaged at a cost per meal of just 50 cents, when we make sure that food that is edible and is recovered timelessly, that food reaches communities that need it most. That's what the food donations policy is intended for.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much for your time. I think definitely one will now start to be a little bit more conscious when they start to consume, prepare, or even buy food. That is FoodForward South Africa Managing Director Andy Du Plessis talking to us. Well.